Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Knight, you come from the Mercatus Center, funded generously by the Koch brothers, as was the Cato Institute. And I, of course, represent George Mason University, where you're located. I have a simple question for you. The Republican Conference Chair, Elise Stefanik, recently said people who are being imprisoned for crimes committed during January 6th are hostages. Do you agree, yes or no, that the people who have been arrested, tried, convicted, sentenced, and are serving those sentences are in fact hostages?
I have not studied that. My initial inclination is no. And if I can elaborate, I have not read all the transcripts of all the convictions, but I will assume the answer is no.
Thank you. I just find it interesting. You can opine about amendments to the Constitution and infringements and warrants, but you haven't really looked at the issue of whether people who committed crimes in January 6th are hostages or not. Thank you for that moral equivocation. Officer Fanon, maybe you don't want to equivocate. What do you think? I mean, I'm listening to my colleagues, I'm listening to this testimony, and apparently you got it wrong. On January 6th, there were peaceful citizens simply protesting on behalf of their First, Second, and Fourth Amendment rights, carrying Bibles, who had just assembled peacefully to express themselves here in the Capitol. Isn't that what you encountered on January 6th?
That couldn't be further from the truth. I mean, my encounter was brutal. It was violent. It involved a number of individuals restraining me, beating me. At least one individual, while I was being restrained, beaten, subjecting me to electroshock from a taser device on my neck, all the while resulting in injuries I sustained as a traumatic brain injury as well as a heart attack.
So, Mr. Tedesco talked about, among other things, law enforcement running roughshod over citizens, simply expressing their First and Second Amendment rights. I had the impression that, law enforcement that day apparently was violently seizing Bibles of good Christians who were simply trying to exercise their faith because we were targeting them for their faith. Is that what happened on January 6th?
Listen, I responded to the Capitol that day for no other purpose than to assist fellow officers who were calling out for help. I didn't care about the location, the Capitol building itself, and quite frankly, I didn't give a shit about the members of Congress. I just came here because cops needed help. That was it.
We'll pretend you didn't say that first part. By the way, just an by the way, because we've heard some interesting testimony again. In your how long were you in law enforcement?
20 years.
20 years. In those 20 years, were you ever made aware of any effort by the FBI or law enforcement in general to surveil the financial information of individuals because of their beliefs or views? Because that's what we're being led to believe has been occurring.
No, and I worked in collaboration.
I'm sorry, real loud and clear. 20 years of experience, have you ever experienced what they're describing?
No.
No. Would you find that odd if you did stumble upon it?
Yes.
Why?
Because it violates the very principles of law enforcement, upholding the Constitution and respecting Americans' rights.
So I'm gonna run out of time. First of all, I cannot tell you how much, even though I am a member of Congress, I was on the floor on January 6th. I heard it. I saw a lot. I cannot imagine what you've gone through and how you are still living through PTSD. My office was attacked last May, and we're still living through PTSD. And it was violently attacked. And I can only imagine. And you are a hero. And, no matter what the attempts may be of some to minimize, diminish, or even fabricate what really happened on January 6th, I assure you, there are a number of us who will continue to fight for the truth to make sure the American people know exactly what happened and that we won't equivocate about whether criminals who are justifiably in jail for their crimes that day are not hostages. They're criminals. They violated the law. And I cannot think of a more significant breach of the Constitution than a violent attempt to prevent the free exercise of an election being counted here in the Capitol. I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman. Thanks for the witnesses being here today. And, you know, we're here to talk about apparently a range of things that don't involve the topic of the hearing. And I think that's disappointing. Freedom surrendered is rarely reclaimed. And we have an opportunity to do that. Few of the rights protected by our Constitution are more infringed than the right to privacy. My colleague, Mr. Massey, read the actual text of the Fourth Amendment. And Mr. Peterson, Dr. Peterson, you referenced kind of what a lot of people might wish it said. It does not say that if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. It says that you have a reasonable expectation of privacy. It doesn't say you have an expectation of complete secrecy. The reasonable expectation of privacy is guarded by due process, warrants, and subpoenas for U.S. citizens. You might not know that many of the members of this committee are part of something really rare in Congress, which is a nonpartisan view. We've got divisions that don't break on party lines on privacy. There are Republicans and Democrats who want to roll back the Patriot Act. What a beautiful name, but it's being used to violate American citizens' rights to privacy. We have one of the rarest things possible. You have Mr. Jordan and Mr. Nadler in complete agreement on how to reform the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And frankly, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act part works pretty well. It's the Domestic Surveillance Act. Well, there isn't one because the Fourth Amendment guards it. It says you're supposed to get a warrant. And we're covering a giant hole here, not about January 6th. What about the Bank Secrecy Act and third-party doctrine? Things that are being abused, weaponized against the citizens of this country. Now, they don't have all these same safeguards in Canada, and Dr. Peterson, you've experienced some of the consequences of not having the safeguards that we have in this country. I wonder if you could elaborate on how consequential it is to have the safeguards we do have here on privacy and speech.
Well, I know that my colleagues on the psychological front and on the medical front in Canada are increasingly frightened of making any of their political opinions known in any form whatsoever because governmental agencies, usually of the mid-level bureaucratic sort, have been empowered as a consequence of our lack of First Amendment rights to intervene as they see fit in relationship to stated opinion, political or otherwise. And it's not good. It's seriously not good. And there's new legislation coming up also reflecting that lack of proper constitutional protection that will make even the suspicion that a crime may be committed punishable. That's Bill C-63, which is pending before the Canadians.
These are dangerous ideas, and I appreciate that you highlighted how China's using it. And frankly, there are people in the United States pushing for a central bank digital currency that at the core is a violation of privacy. It is really the one ring to rule them all. It is a massive amount of coercive power, and at the root of it is the surveillance capability. And a lot of that, Mr. Knight, you've highlighted with the consequences of the Bank Secrecy Act. And I just wonder, you know, a couple of you have highlighted the cost-benefit ratio, Mr. Michel as well. Maybe you could highlight the consequences of the Bank Secrecy Act and how we might reform it so that we can accomplish the stated goal of safety, but in a more constitutional framework.
Happy to speak to that. I think what we've seen in this hearing is that one of the big consequences is that people blur the distinction between not being able to access information or being able to access information subject to due process. There's no reason to believe that the convictions obtained after January 6th would be impossible without getting a warrant or information subject to one of the exceptions to the warrant provision for exigent circumstances. We also have to worry about the fact that information is being collected and is very collectible. If you are worried about your political opponents having power, why do you want this available to them?
Thank you. Mr. Michelle, you mentioned the third-party doctrine and the hazard of that. I mean, frankly, I'm reminded of a story that's disputed whether it was fully accurate or not, but when Nikita Khrushchev became the leader for the Soviet Union, he was pointing out how brutal the regime had been under Stalin. And someone from a large crowd yelled to him, "Why didn't you do anything?" And here he is, the dictator of the Soviet Union, everyone knowing the kind of power that he could wield. And he said, "Who said that? I demand to know who said that." And everyone got quiet. And he let it stay quiet for a very long time. And he said, "That's why. Because you know the coercive power of the state." Now, I would submit that the police-state powers that have existed in previous eras of history are minor compared to the capabilities that we have. When you link that to the consequences of the unmitigated third-party doctrine, can you lay out for us what's at stake?
Well, it literally means that anytime you engage in any commercial transaction, you are effectively saying, okay, I don't have due process anymore, which is rather insane. It turns the concept completely on its head that we all have due process.
So I think we have a really incredible burden to produce legislation that does reclaim the freedom that has been surrendered. And I hope we continue to work together in a bipartisan fashion to deliver that reform. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
I have a
Unanimous consent from,
Mr. Chairman, I have a unanimous consent request entitled, this is an FBI liaison information report entitled Domestic Violent Extremists Emboldened in Aftermath of Capitol Breach. It cites online rhetoric regarding the 20 January presidential inauguration, with some calling for unspecified justice for the January 6th shooting by law enforcement of an individual at the Capitol building, and another positing that, quote, many armed individuals would return on 19 January, according to open source reporting.
without objection.
Thank you.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, hey, just hold 1 second, if you could. We'll stop your time. I should have mentioned, if any of you need a break, just let us know. If you have to run to the restroom or anything like that, just let us know. We've been going at this 2 hours. We've probably got a half hour to go. If you can find, but if you need a break, just let us know and we'll go there. I apologize. Gentleman's recognized.
No problem, Mr. Chairman. It's unfortunate that this hearing is tended to focus on January 6th and the inaugural that followed 2 weeks later, because there is a legitimate question about the gathering of information, mostly by private sector, businesses and the like, and then the government accessing that information. It's a worldwide phenomena, and it is something that we should be focusing on. Unfortunately, what's happened here in this hearing is that we've taken the January 6th issue, the insurrection, the violence, the harm that came to Officer Falone and others, and morphed it into a larger question of our civil liberties. That's unfortunate. But here we are, using this hearing to somehow degrade the violence and the insurrection itself and the ultimate effort to destroy our democracy. So I think we have to stay with that a few seconds. Officer Falone, just a couple of questions I want to get clear. Do you have the number of insurrectionists, rioters that have been charged and found guilty?
Correct.
Do you know that the number is, I think, over 1,100?
That's my understanding, close to 1,200.
In this process, was any information developed that indicated there might be future violence, for example, at the inaugural?
Yes, that's my understanding from speaking to those involved in the investigation.
Do any of the witnesses disagree with that? Okay. And based on this, is it reasonable for the federal government, FBI, and other agencies to investigate certain individuals in an effort to prevent future violence? Is that a reasonable thing for the government to do?
Again, I don't only think it's reasonable. I think that it's a requirement.
Now, do any of you disagree that it would be reasonable for the federal government to investigate those who were involved and the threats that there might be future violence? Is that something that the FBI and others should do?
I would disagree with that to some degree. It depends on how they do it. Because
Thank you. Point well made. Not going to.
okay, yeah.
So the notion of continued investigation based upon information received as a result of the conviction and investigations of those that were involved in the insurrection, the rioting, would be reasonable. So now we get down to the point, and this is where this hearing really got off track, and it's unfortunate to equate this issue of our personal civil liberties and privacies with the January 6th insurrection. We need to divide these two issues. There's no doubt we had an insurrection. There's no doubt we had a riot. There's no doubt that Officer Vallone, you were injured along with 140 other officers. The film that was shown earlier clearly demonstrates that, and your own testimony. We thank you for your work that day. I think I agree with Mr. Connolly. You may not think it important to protect us, but we certainly thought, and we thank you for having done so. But the reality is that it was an extraordinary, serious event in America's history. It was the single largest assault on police ever in the history of this nation. Now, based upon that, where do we go? Put that over here. And then, Mr. Chairman, if you would, put all of that aside and stop trying to protect Mr. Trump or anybody else that was involved in that riot, in that insurrection, and let's get down to the issue of protecting our civil liberties. There are multiple examples that could be used and evidence that could be used to get to that point. Some of it presented by the witnesses today, unfortunately wrapped up in the January 6th and the insurrection and the subsequent question of the inaugural. I do note, as I drove here this morning, that a new fence has been put around the Capitol building. Now, this speaks to all of our safety. And why is it that in America today we have the need for a new 7-foot-high fence around the Capitol on the day that the President arrives to give his State of the Union? So I think I'll just leave it there with the seconds left. And Mr. Chairman, if you would put aside your desire to go after and protect the President and get down to the issues that are really critically important for all of us, I would appreciate it. And I think this country would also.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from Wyoming is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've been focusing on how technological platforms and advancement further fuels the weaponization of the federal government in collaboration with big corporations against the American people. At least that was the intent of this hearing, and it is the intent of the folks on this side of the aisle. Today, it is how developments in financial technology have aided the surveillance of the American people. And during our last hearing, we focused on how AI is expanding the monitoring and suppression of speech. Today, I want to focus on new reporting which connects the financial surveillance and AI together. Last month, journalist James O'Keefe posted a report alleging that the IRS and DOJ were utilizing AI technology to assist with the surveillance of American bank accounts. These allegations are that AI can access bank accounts and look inside those accounts versus just seeing activities in the account. This surveillance by the IRS is being done without a warrant, and it is being done in coordination with the DOJ. Just 2 months before this revelation, FinCEN informed us in staff briefings that banks were beginning to deploy AI technology in their business models. Meanwhile, we are watching Google's Gemini's failures from its politically biased model, which Google co-founder Sergey Brin called left-leaning, which I believe is pretty much the understatement of the year. In the report released by this subcommittee last night, we document how the FBI and FinCEN reported information to assist financial surveillance, which certain Americans based on strictly conservative ideas. Mr. Knight, You noted that we are limited to speak on what has been reported related to the financial surveillance regime because so little is known by the public in Congress. The timeline that I just described provides little detail, but it does show that this area is developing very quickly and raises further concerns about federal agencies undertaking dragnet surveillance using financial records. Based on what we know so far about the coordination between the financial sector and federal government, does the addition of AI into this equation cause even greater concern regarding the scope and scale of financial surveillance that we can expect to occur in the future?
So I believe it does for several reasons. One, to the extent that it makes something less expensive, you'll get more of it. Two, to the extent that AI is not well tuned, either intentionally or unintentionally, you're going to get the risk that you're going to not only have more false positives, but also that it's going to start selecting for information that may not be appropriate. Three, there's concern, and I don't want to overblow the concern, but it does exist, that AI tends to be opaque, and this regime is already opaque enough. So if the great and powerful Oz is spitting out records that it considers suspicious and you don't know why, and we can't assess how appropriate it is, that's obviously very problematic. And so I think that we do need to be cautious. And I would say one distinction between this and maybe some other areas is here we're talking about feeding information to the government. So there are constitutional implications here that don't necessarily exist in other areas. Doesn't mean we shouldn't be cautious in other areas, but we should be especially cautious here.
I appreciate your response, and I think that you're actually spot on. Also of concern with the evolution of AI in relation to this liberty-infringing regime that we're dealing with right now, the Biden administration, is the fact that it removes human accountability. What we have learned so far is that the information we have so far came from a paper trail from a government employee. Yet with AI, that paper trail is going to disappear. Mr. Michel, what could another layer of secrecy achieved by displacing human action with AI do to further erode our liberties and basic guarantees of privacy?
Well, I mean, at first I would just caution that banks and financial institutions have been using technology at an increasing rate for a very long time, and the problem still, the bigger problem is the principle. And if we guarantee due process and we guarantee that law enforcement needs a warrant to get that information, then I think that's a better place. But aside from that, yes, the better and the broader the technology allows people to reach, or the finer detail that it allows people to get, then obviously the more of it you're going to get. But I think Brian is right in that it's going to make it more efficient and less costly, so you'll get more of it. But again, the principle of the Fourth Amendment, the due process, that's what's key here.
Thank you. I appreciate that. With that, I yield back.